The fluorescent lights of Pete's 24/7 diner buzzed softly as I wiped down the counter for the 100th time that night. It was just past 11 p.m., and the place was as dead as ever. Located on a stretch of highway that seemed to exist between towns rather than connect them, our diner saw more tumbleweeds than customers most nights. I'd been working the graveyard shift for about 6 months, and the novelty had long worn off. The pay was decent, and the solitude suited me fine, but there was an eerie quality to the nights that I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the way shadows seemed to linger a little too long in the corners, or how the wind howled through the parking lot like a lost soul. My co-workers, Jimmy the cook and Doris the other waitress, were in the back, probably sneaking a cigarette. I didn't mind. It left me alone with my thoughts and the soft crackle of the ancient radio that Pete refused to replace. As I moved between the tables, straightening salt shakers and aligning napkin dispensers, I caught my reflection in the large window that faced the highway. In the dim light, I looked more like a ghost than a person, pale, tired, with dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. This job was taking its toll, but I needed the money for college, so I endured. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and I braced myself for the wave of truckers that usually rolled in around this time, hungry for coffee and greasy eggs. But tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an anticipation I couldn't explain. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to too many late nights and not enough sleep. Just as I was about to head to the back and check on Jimmy and Doris, the bell above the door chimed. I turned, plastering on my best welcome to Pete's smile, ready to greet whoever had decided to stop by our little oasis of fluorescent light and burnt coffee. But the smile froze on my face as I saw him. A tall figure, shrouded in a black overcoat that seemed to absorb what little light there was in the diner. He stood motionless in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. And in that moment, though I didn't know it yet, my ordinary life began its descent into terror. The man in the black overcoat moved silently to a booth in the far corner of the diner. His movements were fluid, almost unnaturally so, as if he were gliding rather than walking. I stood rooted to the spot, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the diner. "Sarah!" Jimmy's voice from the kitchen snapped me out of my trance. "Everything all right out there?" I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the unease. "Yeah, just a customer." As I approached the booth, menu in hand, I could feel my heart pounding. Up close, the man was even more unsettling. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes. God, his eyes were like empty wells, dark and bottomless. "Good evening, sir," I managed to stammer out. "Welcome to Pete's. Can I get you a menu?" He didn't respond, didn't even look at me. Just raised one long, pale finger and pointed at the laminated menu already on the table. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course. I'll give you a moment to decide." I retreated to the counter, feeling his gaze boring into my back. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still staring at the menu, motionless. Doris emerged from the back, tying her apron. "Who's the creep in the corner?" she whispered, eyeing the man warily. "New customer," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got it covered." Doris shrugged and moved to wipe down some tables, but I noticed she kept her distance from the mysterious man's booth. After what felt like an eternity, I steeled myself and approached him again. "Have you decided, sir?" This time, he looked up. His gaze felt like ice water running through my veins. Slowly, deliberately, he pointed to an item on the menu, a glass of water. Just water?" I asked, confused. He nodded almost imperceptibly. I hurried to fetch the water, my hands shaking as I filled the glass. When I returned to his table, I set it down carefully, noticing how the water seemed to fog up instantly, as if the glass had been pulled from a freezer. "Will there be anything else?" I asked, praying the answer would be no. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving mine. I nodded and turned to leave, but his voice, low and raspy like dry leaves scraping across pavement, stopped me in my tracks. "Thursday," he said, 11:45 p.m. I spun around, but he was already standing, moving towards the exit. Before I could say anything, he was gone, the bell above the door tinkling in his wake. The glass of water sat on the table, untouched and eerily cold. As I stared at it, a sense of foreboding washed over me. Something told me this was just the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't yet comprehend. True to his word, he returned the following Thursday at precisely 11:45 p.m. And the Thursday after that, and the one after that. It became a bizarre routine, as regular as clockwork and just as unnerving. Each time it was the same: the black overcoat, the deathly pale skin, those hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. Always the same booth, always just a glass of water that remained untouched. And always, without fail, at 11:45 p.m. The other staff started calling him the Clockwork Man behind his back. Jimmy refused to cook for him after the third week, claiming the man's presence made the stove go cold. Doris wouldn't go near his table, crossing herself whenever he entered the diner. But for some reason, he would only interact with me. If anyone else approached his table, he would sit motionless, unresponsive. It was as if they didn't exist to him. I found myself both dreading and anticipating his visits. The fear never quite went away, but it was overshadowed by an insatiable curiosity. Who was he? Why did he come here every week just to order water he never drank? As the weeks passed, I started noticing changes in myself. I felt constantly on edge, jumping at shadows and struggling to sleep. The diner, once just a job, now felt like a trap closing in around me. One night, as I handed him his usual glass of water, our fingers brushed. The chill that ran through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. In that moment, I saw flashes of darkness, of otherworldly realms that defied description. I pulled away, gasping, and saw a hint of a smile on his pale lips. That's when I knew I had to get out. This wasn't just some eccentric customer. He was something else, something dangerous. And for whatever reason, he had chosen me. I needed a plan. I needed to escape. But how do you run from something that doesn't seem entirely human? As my encounters with the mysterious man continued, strange occurrences began to plague the diner. It started small, utensils would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. The jukebox would suddenly start playing on its own, always the same haunting melody that none of us recognized. Then things escalated. One night, all the clocks in the diner stopped at 11:45, the exact time when he usually arrived. They started working again the moment he left. Another time, Doris swore she saw her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser move independently of her, grinning maliciously. The other staff were terrified. People started quitting, unable to handle the growing sense of wrongness that permeated the place. But I stayed, partly out of stubbornness, partly out of fear of what might happen if I tried to leave. The whispers started soon after. At first, I thought it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I began to make out words, snippets of conversations that made no sense. They always seemed to come from empty corners or shadowy spaces, growing louder whenever he was present. "She's the one," they would say. "He's chosen her." I tried to ignore them, to rationalize it all away. But it was getting harder and harder to deny that something supernatural was happening. One particularly quiet night, as I was wiping down his table after he left, I noticed something carved into the surface. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. Leaning in close, I could make out a single word: soon. My blood ran cold. I looked up, catching my reflection in the window. For a split second, I thought I saw him standing behind me, those bottomless eyes staring into mine. I whirled around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty diner and the ever-present hum of the fluorescent lights. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, a decision formed in my mind. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave, not just the diner, but this town, this state, maybe even this country. Whatever this entity was, whatever it wanted from me, I couldn't let it catch me. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my mind raced with plans of escape, of new beginnings in far-off places. Little did I know, escaping would prove to be far more challenging than I could have ever imagined. The next few days were a blur of frantic planning and paranoid glances over my shoulder. I knew I had to leave before the next Thursday, but every step I took felt watched, every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. I began by quietly liquidating what little I had. I sold my car to a local dealership, converted my savings to cash, and packed a single bag with essentials. The less I had to carry, the faster I could move. My destination? I settled on Japan. It was far, culturally different, and somewhere I'd always wanted to visit. Plus, the idea of losing myself in the bustling crowds of Tokyo seemed like the perfect way to disappear. But as I made my preparations, the strange occurrences intensified. My apartment key wouldn't work one night, only to function normally when I tried again hours later. I'd wake up to find all my clocks stopped at 11:45. Once, I even found a glass of water on my nightstand, ice cold and misty, though I knew I hadn't put it there. The whispers followed me everywhere now, no longer confined to the diner. They echoed in empty rooms, hissed from drain pipes, even seemed to come from my own phone when I tried to make calls. "You can't run," they said. "He's waiting. He's always waiting." Despite the growing dread, I pressed on with my plans. I booked a flight for Wednesday night, mere hours before his usual arrival time at the diner. I figured if I could make it to the airport, I'd be safe. On my last day at work, I tried to act normal, but my nerves were frayed to breaking point. Every chime of the bell above the door made me jump. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to move. As my shift ended, I said goodbye to Jimmy and Doris, trying to keep my voice steady. They looked concerned, but I waved off their questions with excuses about feeling under the weather. Just as I was about to walk out the door, I froze. There, in the reflection of the glass, I saw him. The man in the black coat was sitting in his usual booth, staring directly at me. But when I spun around, the booth was empty. I ran. The drive to the airport was a nightmare. Every red light felt like an eternity, every dark car behind me a potential threat. The whispers had grown to a constant, maddening drone, filling the car despite the radio blaring at full volume. I abandoned my car in the long-term parking, not caring about the fees. As I rushed through the airport, my single bag clutched to my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Check-in was a blur. I handed over documents with shaking hands, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The board attendant didn't seem to notice my distress, or if she did, she didn't comment. As I made my way to security, a familiar chill ran down my spine. Slowly, I turned around, and there he was. The man in the black coat stood at the far end of the terminal, his hollow eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me. I pushed through the crowd, not caring about the angry exclamations in my wake. I had to get through security. Somehow, I knew he couldn't follow me there. As I reached the security line, I risked another glance back. He was closer now, moving through the crowd with that unnatural gliding walk. But he wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. His face wore an expression of calm certainty, as if he knew, no matter what I did, he would catch me. I practically threw my bag onto the conveyor belt, fumbling with my shoes and jacket. The security officer frowned at my obvious distress, pulling me aside for additional screening. "No, please," I begged. "I'll miss my flight." "He's coming. Please, you have to let me through." The officer looked confused, glancing around. "Who's coming, ma'am?" I turned to point at the man in the black coat, but he was gone. The space where he had been standing was empty, filled only with ordinary travelers going about their business. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? As the security officer led me to a private room for questioning, I realized with sinking dread that my escape might be over before it had truly begun. The security office was small and sterile, with harsh fluorescent lighting that made my eyes ache. Two officers sat across from me, their faces a mix of concern and suspicion. "Miss, can you explain why you were so agitated at the security checkpoint?" one of them asked. I opened my mouth to speak, but where could I even begin? How could I explain the supernatural terror that had been haunting me for months? They'd think I was insane. As I struggled to find words, a movement in the corner of the room caught my eye. A shadow, darker than it should be, seemed to writhe and stretch. And then I heard it, the whispers, faint but unmistakable. "Tell them," the whispers urged. "Make them understand." Something in me snapped. The fear, the tension, the constant paranoia, it all came pouring out. I told them everything. About the mysterious man, the strange occurrences at the diner, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted. As I spoke, the room grew colder. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I saw shock register on the officers' faces. They could feel it too. When I finished, silence fell. Then, to my surprise, one of the officers leaned forward, his face grave. "We've heard stories like yours before," he said quietly. "Not often, but enough to know there are things in this world that defy explanation." Hope surged through me. They believed me. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of possibility that I might actually escape. But as the officer opened his mouth to speak again, the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black of the security office, panic threatened to overwhelm me. I could hear the officers moving, calling for backup, but their voices seemed distant, muffled. Then, a familiar chill permeated the air. I knew with terrifying certainty that he was here. "Sarah," his voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Did you really think you could run from me?" The darkness around me shifted, coalesced. I could make out his silhouette, those bottomless eyes now glowing faintly in the dark. "What do you want from me?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. He chuckled, a sound like ice cracking. "What I want, my dear, is you. Your curiosity, your fear, your very essence. You saw beyond the veil, and now you belong to the spaces between." As he spoke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe some part of me had always known it would come to this. But in that moment, I realized I was tired of running, tired of being afraid. "No," I said firmly. "I don't belong to you or to any spaces between. I belong to myself." He hissed, the darkness around him roiling. "You don't have a choice," foolish girl. You're mine." As he lunged towards me, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out and grabbed his arm. The moment we touched, it was like a circuit completing. Energy surged through me, cold and ancient and terrifying. But instead of pulling away, I held on tighter. Memories that weren't mine flashed through my mind. I saw countless others he had stalked, had taken. I felt their fear, their despair. But I also felt something else, a weakness, a vulnerability. He was powerful, yes, but he needed our fear, fed on it. Without it, he was nothing. Understanding flooded through me. I looked into those bottomless eyes and spoke, my voice ringing with newfound power. "I am not afraid of you," I declared. "You have no power over me." He shrieked, a sound of fury and disbelief. The darkness around us began to dissipate, and I could see the shocked faces of the security officers. "This isn't over," he snarled, his form already beginning to fade. "Yes," I said firmly, "it is." With a final, inhuman howl, he vanished. The lights flickered back to life, revealing the bewildered security officers and the now ordinary room. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the officers cleared his throat. "Miss," he said carefully, "I think you'd better tell us everything." Again. As the adrenaline faded, I sank into a chair, feeling drained but strangely liberated. The whispers were gone. The constant feeling of being watched had vanished. I knew I had a lot of explaining to do, and that my life would never be the same. But for the first time in months, I felt free. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I still held onto the dream of Japan. Not as an escape now, but as a new beginning. 6 months later, I found myself standing in the bustling streets of Tokyo, surrounded by neon lights and the constant hum of city life. After the incident at the airport, my life had taken an unexpected turn. The security officers, convinced by what they had witnessed, became unexpected allies. They helped me navigate the aftermath, even assisting with my visa application for Japan. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were just that, nightmares, not the terrifying reality I had lived before. The whispers had faded to nothing more than a distant memory. As I wandered through the crowded streets, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. Here, in this vibrant city on the other side of the world, I was just another face in the crowd. No mysterious figures haunted my peripheral vision. No supernatural chill followed me. I had found a job teaching English, and while it wasn't glamorous, it was honest work that allowed me to start rebuilding my life. More importantly, it was normal. Wonderfully, beautifully normal. As I stopped at a small ramen shop for dinner, I caught my reflection in the window. The person staring back at me was stronger, more confident. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Whatever forces existed in the spaces between, whatever cosmic horror had chosen me, I had proven that the human spirit was stronger. I had reclaimed my life, my freedom, and my future. And as I stepped into the warm, inviting shop, I smiled. This wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning. Looking back, I often wonder how my life might have turned out if I had chosen a different path. But 5 years ago, fresh out of college and desperate for work, I found myself taking the night shift at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Little did I know that this seemingly mundane job would lead me to question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the blurry line between them. The fluorescent lights of Midnight Eats Diner buzzed softly overhead as I wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that night. It was just past 11 p.m., and the place was as dead as ever. Located on a stretch of highway that seemed to exist between towns rather than connect them, our diner saw more tumbleweeds than customers most nights. I'd been working the graveyard shift for about 6 months, and the novelty had long worn off. The pay was decent, and the solitude suited me fine, but there was an eerie quality to the nights that I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the way shadows seemed to linger a little too long in the corners, or how the wind howled through the parking lot like a lost soul. My co-workers, Jimmy the cook and Doris the other waitress, were in the back, probably sneaking a cigarette. I didn't mind. It left me alone with my thoughts and the soft crackle of the ancient radio that our boss, Pete, refused to replace. As I moved between the tables, straightening salt shakers and aligning napkin dispensers, I caught my reflection in the large window that faced the highway. In the dim light, I looked more like a ghost than a person, pale, tired, with dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. This job was taking its toll, but I needed the money, so I endured. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and I braced myself for the wave of truckers that usually rolled in around this time, hungry for coffee and greasy eggs. But tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an anticipation I couldn't explain. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to too many late nights and not enough sleep. Just as I was about to head to the back and check on Jimmy and Doris, the bell above the door chimed. I turned, plastering on my best welcome to Midnight Eats smile, ready to greet whoever had decided to stop by our little oasis of fluorescent light and burnt coffee. Little did I know, this customer would change everything. He walked in with the confidence of a regular, despite the fact that I'd never seen him before. An older gentleman, probably in his late 60s, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed back and a well-worn but clean suit. He moved with a deliberate grace that seemed at odds with the late hour and the general weariness that clung to most of our midnight patrons. As he settled into a booth by the window, I grabbed a menu and made my way over. Up close, there was something about him that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the harsh diner lighting, and his eyes, they seemed to hold a depth that I couldn't quite fathom. "Good evening, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Welcome to Midnight Eats. Can I get you started with something to drink?" He looked up at me, and for a moment, I felt like I was falling into those eyes. Then he smiled, and the spell was broken. "Just coffee, please," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And I know what I want to eat. Steak, rare, with potatoes." I nodded, jotting down his order. "Coming right up, sir." As I turned to head back to the kitchen, he spoke again. "I'll be coming here often," he said. It wasn't a question or even really a statement. It was more like a promise. True to his word, he became a regular fixture at the diner. Every night, without fail, he'd come in around midnight. Always the same order: steak, rare, with potatoes. Always the same booth by the window. Always the same polite but distant demeanor. The other staff started calling him the Clockwork Man because of his predictable routine. Jimmy would have his order ready before he even walked in the door. Doris found excuses not to serve his table, claiming he gave her the creeps. But for some reason, I was drawn to him. There was a gentleness to his manner that contrasted sharply with the unease I felt in his presence. It was a puzzle I couldn't solve, and it fascinated me. Weeks turned into months, and his visits became as much a part of my routine as wiping down tables or refilling salt shakers. But as time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to our mysterious customer. Something that, perhaps, I wasn't ready to understand. Little did I know, I was about to be pulled into a mystery that would challenge everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the spaces in between. As the weeks turned into months, My fascination with our mysterious regular grew, but so did my unease. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was in the little things, the details that most people would overlook. For one, despite ordering the same meal every night, a rare steak with potatoes, I never actually saw him eat. The food would disappear, sure, but I never caught him mid-bite. It was as if the meal vanished when I wasn't looking. Then there was his appearance. While he always looked impeccable in his well-worn suit, I realized that I never saw him in anything else. Night after night, the same outfit, never a wrinkle out of place, never a stain from the countless steaks he'd supposedly consumed. But it was his physical presence that truly unsettled me. On busy nights, when the diner was full of truckers and late-night wanderers, the air would be thick with the smell of coffee, grease, and humanity. Yet around him, there was nothing. No scent, no warmth. It was as if he was a hole in the world, a place where reality didn't quite fit right. I found myself watching him more closely, stealing glances as I served other customers. Sometimes, I could have sworn I saw his reflection in the window flicker, like an old TV losing signal. But every time I looked directly at him, he was solid, present, real. One night, as I refilled his perpetually full coffee cup, I decided to engage him in conversation. "You must really like our steak," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You've had the same thing every night for months." He looked up at me, those unfathomable eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I felt a chill run through me, as if I'd stepped into a freezer. Then he smiled, and the feeling passed. "When you find something that suits you," he said, his voice as gravelly as ever, "why change?" I nodded, not knowing how to respond. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "You're very observant, aren't you?" There was something in his tone. Amusement? Warning? I couldn't tell. "I try to be," I replied, my heart pounding. He nodded, almost to himself. "That's good. Observation is the key to understanding. But be careful, my dear. Some things, once observed, can't be unseen." With that cryptic statement, he turned back to his untouched meal, leaving me with more questions than ever. It was a Tuesday night, unremarkable in every way, when everything changed. The diner was quieter than usual. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional clink of dishes from the kitchen the only sounds breaking the silence. I was wiping down tables, my mind wandering, when the bell above the door chimed. I turned, expecting to see our mysterious regular, right on schedule. But the man who walked in was barely recognizable. It was him, I was sure of it, but he looked wrong. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, his suit wrinkled and stained. His salt and pepper hair, usually neatly combed, was wild and unkempt. But it was his face that truly shocked me. He was deathly pale, more so than usual, with a gray tinge to his skin that made him look like a corpse. His eyes, normally so deep and unfathomable, were bloodshot and frantic. He stumbled to his usual booth, collapsing into it with none of his usual grace. I approached cautiously, menu in hand, more out of habit than necessity. "Sir," I asked, unable to keep the concern from my voice, "are you all right?" He looked up at me, and I had to stifle a gasp. Up close, he looked even worse. His skin had a waxy quality to it, and I could see blue-veined spider-webbing beneath the surface. "The usual," he rasped, his voice even rougher than normal. "Please." I nodded, hurrying to the kitchen to place his order. When I returned with his coffee, I noticed his hands trembling as he reached for the cup. "Sir," I said, my concern overriding my usual professional distance, "are you sure you're okay?" Do you need me to call someone? He shook his head, a sad smile playing at his lips. No, my dear. There's no one to call. This is how it must be. I didn't understand, but I nodded and went to fetch his meal when it was ready. As I set the plate in front of him, he suddenly reached out, his icy fingers wrapping around my wrist. I froze, shock and fear coursing through me. Listen to me, he said, his voice urgent. This is my last meal. Remember that. Remember me. I stared at him, my mind reeling. His eyes, now clear and focused, bore into mine with an intensity that made me shiver. I don't understand, I whispered. You will, he replied, releasing my wrist. Soon, you'll understand everything. As I stepped back, rubbing my wrist where his cold touch lingered, he picked up his knife and fork. For the first time since he'd started coming to the diner, I watched him take a bite of his steak. A look of pure bliss crossed his face, followed quickly by profound sadness. Thank you, he said softly, for everything. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and retreated to the counter. For the rest of the night, I watched him eat his meal with slow, deliberate bites, savoring every mouthful as if it truly was his last. When he finally stood to leave, he looked at me one last time. Goodbye, he said simply, and walked out into the night. I never saw him again, at least, not in person. The next morning, I woke up later than usual, my mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. As I shuffled into the kitchen to make coffee, my roommate, Jen, was already there, engrossed in the newspaper. Hey, sleepyhead, she said, not looking up. Did you see this? They finally caught that serial killer who's been terrorizing the city. My blood ran cold. What serial killer? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jen pushed the paper towards me. It's been all over the news for months. How have you not heard about this? They're calling him the Midnight Butcher. With trembling hands, I picked up the newspaper. The headline screamed, Midnight Butcher found dead. Serial killer's reign of terror ends. But it was the photo beneath the headline that made my world tilt on its axis. Staring back at me, with those unfathomable eyes I knew so well, was our mysterious regular. The man I had served nearly every night for months. The man who had gripped my wrist just last night and told me it was his last meal. The room spun as I sank into a chair, the newspaper clutched in my shaking hands. I read the article, each word hitting me like a physical blow. The man, whose name I learned was Edward Hartley, had been responsible for a string of gruesome murders across the city. His victims were always found in the early hours of the morning, their bodies mutilated. The article went on to say that Hartley had been found dead in his home, apparently from natural causes. The coroner estimated he had died sometime around midnight the previous night, right around the time he had left the diner. Are you okay? Jen's voice seemed to come from far away. You look like you've seen a ghost. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. A ghost. If only she knew. I think I served him, I managed to choke out. At the diner. Last night. Jen's eyes widened in disbelief. That's impossible, she said gently. He was found dead in his home. The paper says he'd been dead for hours before they found him this morning. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. The cold touch of his hand on my wrist. The sadness in his eyes as he savored his last meal. The finality of his goodbye. As the reality of the situation sank in, a horrifying thought struck me. For months, I had been serving a man who was, by all accounts, already dead. A killer, continuing his routine even after death, trapped in some kind of macabre limbo. The implications were too much to bear. What did this mean about the nature of life and death? About justice and punishment? About the very fabric of reality itself? I knew one thing for certain. My understanding of the world would never be the same again. In the days that followed, I found myself lost in a haze of memories, re-examining every interaction I'd had with Edward Hartley, the Midnight Butcher, through this new, terrifying lens. I remembered the first night he came in, how his presence had immediately set me on edge. Had some part of me sensed the darkness within him? Or had I been picking up on something even more unnatural? The fact that he wasn't truly alive? Every detail took on new, sinister meaning. The way he never seemed to give off body heat, even on the hottest summer nights. How I never saw him actually consume his food, only noticed empty plates after I'd looked away. The eerie stillness that surrounded him, as if he was a void in the bustling energy of the diner. One memory in particular haunted me. About a month into his nightly visits, I had accidentally brushed against him while setting down his coffee. For a split second, I could have sworn my hand passed through him, as if he were made of smoke. I had dismissed it at the time, convinced I was just overtired. Now, I wasn't so sure. Then there were his eyes. Those deep, unfathomable eyes that had always unsettled me. Looking back, I realized they hadn't just been unsettling. They had been empty. Not in the way that people describe cruel or heartless individuals as having dead eyes. No, these were literally empty, as if I was looking into the abyss itself. But what troubled me most were the conversations we'd had. They were few and far between, but each one now seemed loaded with hidden meaning. His comments about finding something that suits you and sticking with it. Was he referring to his grisly crimes? To his punishment of being trapped in this nightly routine? And his final warning to me. Some things, once observed, can't be unseen. Had he known that I would discover the truth? Was it a threat? A warning? Or perhaps, in some twisted way, was it his attempt at protecting me? The more I remembered, the more questions arose, and the more I felt myself sinking into a pit of confusion and fear. I had spent months in the presence of a murderer, a monster. But he was also a dead man walking, a ghost going through the motions of life. What did that make me? A witness? An accomplice? Or something else entirely? Someone chosen to bear witness to a phenomenon beyond human understanding. As I grappled with these thoughts, I knew I couldn't simply let this go. I needed answers, no matter how terrifying they might be. The need for answers consumed me. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the mystery of Edward Hartley. I took time off from the diner, much to the concern of my co-workers, and dove into research. I started with the obvious, news articles about the Midnight Butcher. The details of his crimes were horrific, each murder more gruesome than the last. But what struck me was the timeline. The killings had stopped abruptly 6 months ago, right around the time he started coming to our diner. Next, I delved into the occult, spending hours in the dusty corners of libraries and questionable corners of the internet. I read about ghosts, revenants, and all manner of undead creatures. None quite fit what I had experienced. I even reached out to a local paranormal investigator, careful to frame my questions as research for a story. Her theories about residual hauntings and spectral imprints were interesting, but they didn't explain the physical interactions I'd had with Hartley. As the days passed, my search became more desperate. I visited the street where Hartley had lived, half hoping to see his ghost. I lurked around the police station, trying to overhear any gossip about the case. I even considered trying to contact Hartley's victims' families, though I couldn't bring myself to intrude on their grief. Throughout it all, a nagging question persisted. Why me? Why had Hartley chosen our diner, chosen to interact with me? Was it random chance, or was there some greater purpose? My obsession didn't go unnoticed. Jen started giving me worried looks, and I overheard her on the phone discussing whether I needed professional help. Maybe I did. But I knew that no therapist would believe my story, let alone help me make sense of it. As my search for answers hit dead end after dead end, I found myself drawn back to the diner. If this had started there, perhaps that's where I would find my answers. With a mixture of dread and anticipation, I decided to return to work. Little did I know, the true horror was yet to come. My first night back at the diner was eerily normal. The same flickering lights, the same late-night crowd, the same greasy smell of burgers and fries. Yet everything felt different. Every shadow seemed to hide secrets, every customer a potential threat. As midnight approached, I found myself watching the door, half expecting Hartley to walk in. The bell chimed, and my heart leapt into my throat, but it was just a tired-looking trucker. I was wiping down Hartley's old booth when it happened. My hand brushed against something carved into the table's surface. Looking closer, I saw a message that hadn't been there before. The boundary is thin here. Watch closely. My blood ran cold. I knew, without a doubt, that this was Hartley's handwriting. But how? When? I'd been cleaning this table for months and had never noticed it before. As if in response to my discovery, the diner's atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The lights flickered more intensely, and for a moment, I thought I heard the faint sound of whispers. I looked up, and the world seemed to shift. For a split second, the diner transformed. The walls became darker, the air filled with smoke, and the customers were different. Pale, gaunt figures sat in the booths, their eyes hollow and hungry. At the counter, I saw myself, but not myself. This version of me was as pale and lifeless as the rest. And there, in his usual booth, sat Hartley. He looked up, met my eyes, and smiled a sad, knowing smile. Then, like a film skipping a frame, everything snapped back to normal. The regular customers were back, oblivious to what had just occurred. But I knew what I had seen. Somehow, for just a moment, I had glimpsed the world as Hartley saw it, a purgatory, a place between life and death. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This diner, my workplace, the place I had spent countless nights, was more than just a building. It was a threshold, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and I, unknowingly, had become its guardian. As I stood there, trembling, I understood that my life would never be the same. I was part of something larger now, something I couldn't fully comprehend. And I had a feeling that Hartley's visits were just the beginning. The revelation at the diner changed everything. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unfeel the chill of that otherworldly realm. My life became divided into two parts: the normal, everyday world, and the shadowy, in-between place that I now knew existed just beyond the veil. I continued working at the diner, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. Each shift felt like walking a tightrope between two worlds. I found myself watching the customers closely, wondering if any of them were like Hartley, lost souls trapped in a liminal space. My relationships suffered. How could I explain to friends and family what I was going through? I became withdrawn, jumping at shadows, always on edge. Jen, worried about my mental state, suggested therapy. I agreed, but how could I tell a therapist that I was seeing ghosts and glimpses of the afterlife without being labeled as delusional? Sleep became a luxury. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and endless, smoke-filled diners. I'd wake up gasping, the boundary between dream and reality blurrier than ever. At work, I noticed changes too. The other staff seemed to avoid Hartley's old booth, though they couldn't explain why. Customers who sat there often complained of feeling cold or uneasy. I started to wonder if the booth itself had become a kind of portal, a weak point between our world and the next. Despite the toll it took on me, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I felt a responsibility now, a duty to watch over this threshold. And deep down, a part of me hoped that Hartley might return, that I might get answers to the countless questions that plagued me. As the weeks turned into months, I learned to live with my new reality. The fear never fully left, but it was tempered by a growing sense of purpose. I had been given a glimpse behind the curtain of reality, and there was no going back. A year has passed since that fateful night when Hartley revealed the truth to me. The diner still stands, a beacon for both the living and the dead, and I remain its reluctant guardian, keeper of secrets most will never know. I've come to accept that there are things in this world, and beyond it, that defy explanation. The boundary between life and death, I've learned, is not as clear-cut as we'd like to believe. There are spaces in between, twilight realms where lost souls linger. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the veil seems particularly thin, I think I catch glimpses of Hartley. A reflection in the window, a shadow in the corner of my eye. Is he watching over me, warning me, or is he simply trapped, forever reliving his final moments? I may never have all the answers, and I've made peace with that. But I know now that there's more to our world than what we can see or touch. And in my small corner of it, in this unremarkable diner on a lonely stretch of highway, I stand watch. To those who pass through our doors, we offer coffee, comfort, and a warm meal. But to those caught between worlds, we offer something else, a moment of peace, a last taste of life, before they move on to whatever lies beyond. And me, I'll be here, pouring coffee and watching the shadows, ready for whatever or whoever walks through that door next. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.